Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover three topics. The first one is going to be the ongoing illegal blockade of Artsakh by the Aliyev regime. The second one is going to be the possibility of on the talk that's going around about Armenia possibly joining the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And lastly, we're going to close with an update and some comments about the ongoing negotiations in Washington between Armenia, the United States, and the regime in Baku. Let's start off with the ongoing blockade of Artsakh. Obviously, the blockade continues. We're way past 200 days. What we had this week is the only thing that was allowed to pass through the launching corridor by the regime in Baku were patients that were transferred by the International Red Cross in and out of Artsakh. There were two cases of patients being brought in back and forth. Other than that, nothing. There's not a single morsel of food that has entered Artsakh for nearly 20 days. We've had daily shootings at the border. They're constantly shooting not only at military positions, but more importantly at farmers. They're just trying to live their lives and trying to essentially terrorize them. We're beginning to see serious food shortages, cases of malnutrition, especially among the socially vulnerable. What we're also seeing is a very heightened rhetoric by the regime in Baku, specifically asking for the dismantlement of the Artsakh Defense Forces. And we need to be very clear when we hear that, because when he's demanding the dismantling of the Artsakh Defense Forces, what he's actually demanding is ethnic cleansing, and ethnic cleansing now, because the Artsakh Defense Forces are the only thing that are standing between genocide and no genocide. It is the people's ability to defend themselves. So when he's saying he wants to disband the army, he's saying that he wants people to be ethnically cleansed out of their ancestral homes. Looking at this, and this is almost remarkable given the pressure that people have been living under and this blockade that's gone on for more than 6 months, the way Artsakh has survived is by two things. It is the spirit of resistance that people have and the very strong sense of social solidarity and coming together and to resist essentially what this is in real terms, which is a fascist attempt to carry out an ethnic cleansing of Armenians out of their ancestral homeland. Now we're going to move on to the second topic of the week, which is the scuttlebutt talk that's going around about Armenia joining the Rome Statute. Let me just give you a little bit of a background here. This is obviously related to International Criminal Court, and it allows you to essentially bring state actors, in our case it would be Ilhan Aliyev, to essentially criminalize them and to bring them up for charges of aggression and half a dozen different types of crimes that they have been committing. Armenia has been considering this for a while. What made this controversial locally is the fact that recently the ICC actually indicted Vladimir Putin, which by joining this agreement, you would essentially, technically, you would need to arrest the Russian president if he comes to Armenia, which is obviously something that's never going to happen. This topic came up a couple of months ago, and it sort of died because after Russian warnings. But given the fact that Russian-Armenian relations continue to worsen, and the fact that at this point the Russians are the handmaidens working with the Aliyev regime to starve 120,000 Armenians, it's actually becoming more and more likely that we can sign on to this. And for our immediate purposes, what will allow us to do is to essentially put the Aliyev regime and himself particularly in legal peril. Normally, I would be very cautious with this, but I think as time goes by, this is becoming more attractive because the options are becoming less and less, and the relations with Russia are such that there's almost nothing that comes out of those relations that is in any way positive. So most likely this is something that I suspect is going to happen over the next few months. Let's move on to the third topic of the week, which is an update on the negotiations that are going on in Washington, D.C. between the Armenian government, the United States, who's the mediator, and the Aliyev regime. Immediately after a few days of meetings, what was released by the Armenian Foreign Ministry is that there were three areas of disagreements, that there were wide bridges between the two sides. One of them is the rights and securities of the Armenians living in Artsakh and the international mechanisms to guarantee those rights. The second one was about the demarcation of borders. And the last one was about the withdrawal of the regime troops from occupied Armenian territory. Now, given the fact that these were all the central points, they went on to say that they actually agreed on some other points, which I'm assuming they agreed on where to go to lunch and the size of the table that they should be negotiating around. My first observation here is that when you're talking about the three areas of disagreement, two of them are frankly not even controversial, is because you can't have a peace agreement if Aliyev's forces are still occupying parts of Armenia. And as far as border demarcation, and the fact is, if you go to any of these border areas, Google tells you what the border is. So there already is a border. It's obviously the 1991 Soviet one. So I think the fact that these issues are even controversial, it tells you much about the disingenuousness of the other side and the fact that they're absolutely not interested in peace because these are not in any way controversial issues. What we need to comprehend at this point is that there's actually two sets of negotiations. It is the negotiations that we're conducting with the Americans, which are actually in good faith to reach some kind of a conclusion, some kind of a peace treaty. And then there's the negotiations that are being held on by the Aliyev regime. And they are obviously negotiating in bad faith in Washington, D.C., while the real negotiations is going on with the blockade of Artsakh. Because the blockade actually is their negotiating position, is because it actually gives them an extra blackmail point. And it helps them achieve the goal that they really want, which is not to have a peace treaty, while at the same time reaching their goal of ethnic cleansing out of Artsakh. So what they will do is they will continue these talks to buy time for the real negotiations, which is the stranglement and the starvation of the people of Artsakh, to take hold. And at the end of that, the other negotiation falls apart because there's really nothing to discuss. What is necessary for us in this juncture is to essentially undo what they're trying to do, is to actually not triage the blockade backwards into a secondary issue. The blockade has to be the primary issue. In fact, we need to go to the United Nations Security Council and put everyone on the spot. I know the French are advocating for this. This is frankly, at this point, being held up by the Americans, who think that going to the UN Security Council to essentially come up with the UN mandate to enforce the ICC decisions on opening up the Lachin corridor and ending the blockade will actually end their sacred negotiations, which, by the way, are probably going nowhere. At this juncture, what it's actually important for us to prepare for is actually to prepare for the failure of these talks. We need to be prepared to spin the failure of these talks about who was responsible, and obviously it's the regime in Baku. And we need to have a very coherent narrative with the West. And the first point is that we did everything that you wanted, including the recognition of Artsakh as Azeri territory, and nothing came out of it, and we have no peace. And the second step that we need to demand is the complete securitization of the relationship, i.e., if there's no peace agreement, you need to give us all the tools, whether it's weapon sales or training, for us to be able to strengthen ourselves to defend this country. Third point is to internationalize immediately, from moving on from this failed peace process to internationalizing and making defending the rights and security of the people of Artsakh within the context of international law as something that they need to be forced or be pushed to deliver on, i.e. the UN Security Council or other measures. And more importantly, and finally, punitive measures against the regime in Baku, whether it's Magnitsky sanctions or other sanctions, to essentially punish them for this failure of this process. I'm going to move on and talk about what my views are about what this current Armenian government in Yerevan is doing about the blockade. I think we need to be modest here because, frankly, there's a lot that happens behind the scenes that we're not aware of. So this is sort of an outsider's view, and I grant that. And I also acknowledge the fact and understand that this blockade in many levels is actually a trap for Armenia to get into negotiations, to make concessions on the Sunni corridor and half a dozen different things that we should have no business making concessions on. However, what I'm critical of this government is not prioritizing getting supplies into Artsakh and ending this blockade. This cannot come after as a result of a peace agreement. People do not live on imaginary peace agreements that might never be signed. People live today, and our focus should be that. We need to end the blockade and to focus on that. In fact, we're talking about the weakest point of the enemy. You need to attack them because there's absolutely no moral, legal justification for this. And this is something that's actually helped us in the negotiations process by attacking them on a point. They've added this card to the repertoire of things that they can use against us, and this needs to be taken off the deck. In truth, short of going to war or even going to the UN Security Council, there are 1,000 things that this government or this nation can do to highlight this issue and attack the blockade. This is not the time for quiet diplomacy. That has its place. What is needed is very loud public diplomacy and a public campaign. We need to shout from the mountaintops about the importance of lifting this blockade and coming to the rescue of people in Artsakh. In essence, what we need to do is to open up what I call a third front. We should continue negotiations. We don't need to walk away from that. But we need a very concerted public campaign against this ongoing blockade. For example, we know that the Russians resupply themselves with helicopters, i.e. you have an airlift. We need to demand them to expand that airlift to supply civilians in Artsakh and push the international community and demand them to be part of an airlift, to open up the road and getting supplies into Artsakh. We need to take as many EU, US elected officials to the corridor where the blockage is, where you can actually see the Azeris and the Russians working together to block the road. And hell, if you need to take celebrity there, do it. Whatever it is that generates press and publicity to this. Externalizing the lives and the position and what the Artsakh Armenians are going through is not only morally bankrupt, it's also politically stupid. And as I had stated earlier, this is one of the weakest points for the other side. So we're much better off talking about the blockade, or as much about the blockade as we are about the peace negotiations. This attitude and approach on behalf of the current Armenian government has actually disempowered civil society in Armenia in engaging on the Artsakh issue. And as importantly, it has disempowered the Armenian diaspora to a great extent, and also all other people of goodwill that would be joining us in the fight to end this blockade. And collectively, not just by this government, but for the Armenian nation as a whole, it shows a lack of political imagination and political understanding that we have not been able to unify around this moment to fight this blockade. In conclusion, what have we learned over the last 3 years, which is what we need to learn and do collectively is to actually put a price on the head of killing an Armenian, harming an Armenian, blockading an Armenian, or oppressing an Armenian anywhere. If we accomplish anything, all of those roads must lead to that principle as a beginning. Vengeance is not always the Lord's. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.
Oh, Sultan, Turkish devil and damned devil's kith and kin, secretary to Lucifer himself. What the devil kind of knight are you that can't slay a hedgehog with your own naked arse? The devil shits and your army eats it. You will not, you son of a bitch, make subjects of Christian sons. We've no fear of your army. By land and by sea, we will battle with thee. Fuck your mother. You Babylonian scullion, Macedonian wheelwright, brewer of Jerusalem, goat fucker of Alexandria, swineherd of Greater and Lesser Egypt.